The Iron Hands were the 10th legion of the 20 original Space Marine legions, sometimes referred to as the Iron 10th. Their Primarch is Ferrus Manus. Like the other loyalist legions, much of the Iron Hands forces would later, according to the dictates of the Codex Astartes, be reorganized into smaller chapters. The Iron Hands are notable for their heavy use of bionics and their reverence for all things mechanical, and thus their close ties to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Originally known as the Stormwalkers, the Legion was created during the latter days of the Unification Wars on Terra. Recruitment bases at this time were spread widely all across the planet, but the warlike cultures of Albia in particular provided effective initiates for the Legion. The Legion's first instance of recorded combat was in the Sol system against a mutant warband known as Scythers. Shortly thereafter, they exterminated the Xenos Lyax on the world of Oberath. While the Legion was victorious in both actions, they did not yet seem to specialize in any area of warfare. It was only during the invasion of the Orc-held planet 02-34, designated Rust, that the Legion's effectiveness in utilizing slow-moving mass firepower became apparent. The Primarch of what would later officially become the Iron Hands, Ferrus Manus, also known as the Gorgon, was among the first of the Emperor's sons to be rediscovered. The early history of Ferrus Manus is chronicled in the folklore of Medusa. The most popular of these tales is the Canticle of Travels, which details the trials of Ferrus Manus and his ordeal with the great silver worm known as Aseroth. The Canticle is the only tale that even attempts to explain the mystery of how Ferrus Manus came by his living metal hands. Ferrus Manus never united the people of his homeworld in the way most of the other Primarchs had, on the basis that competition grew greater strength. When the Emperor eventually came to Medusa, Ferrus Manus tested himself against him in a cataclysmic battle that is said to have lain waste to entire mountains. Finally, having found someone his equal, Ferrus accepted the Emperor as his master and took command of the 10th Legion of Space Marines, which was renamed the Iron Hands in his honor. With the Gorgon at their head, the Iron Hands quickly became renowned for their ability to confront enemies of the Great Crusade head-on, gaining a reputation as ruthless and calculating fighters. They excelled at high-intensity warfare against both technologically advanced foes and brutal Xenos such as Orcs, whose sheer power and vast numbers constituted a grave threat to the success of the Crusade. Soon enough, the Iron Hands became known as the Iron 10th and were deliberately deployed to battlefronts, where set-piece engagements against massed armies were likely. As their battle style required advanced war engines, the Iron Hands began to establish their notoriously close ties with the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose culture was astonishingly similar to their own. One of the most notable campaigns waged by the Iron Hands during the Great Crusade was against the Diasporex, a nomadic and technologically advanced multi-species federation, where they and the Emperor's children wiped out the society. Later during the Astrani campaign, the Iron Hands had a severe dispute with the Imperial Fists over what should become of the Astrani machine empire. Ferrus wished for the civilization's destruction as heretics, while Rogel Dawn wanted them assimilated into the larger Imperium. Ultimately, it fell to Horus Lupercal and an honor duel to settle the dispute. At the outset of the heresy, Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's children, tried to turn Ferrus Manus to join the side of the traitors. Despite being vastly different, the Primarchs and their legions had grown close during the Crusade. Despite this, Ferrus refused and tried to kill his brother in a rage. Fulgrim had his fleet launch a crippling attack on the Iron Hands vessels, although he could not bring himself to kill his brother. In the wake of this betrayal, Ferrus took as many of his veterans as he could on board, one of the few undamaged vessels, to participate in the loyalist attack on Istvan V. This proved to be a disaster when 4 of the supposedly loyal legions turned on their allies, resulting in the drop site massacre and horrendous casualties amongst the Raven Guard, Iron Hands, and Salamander's legions. During the height of the fighting, Fulgrim slew Ferrus Manus, making the father of the Iron Hands the first Primarch to fall during the heresy. Rumors have persisted that Ferrus Manus's corpse was taken to Mars, but the Iron Hands deny any such claims. The events at Istvan V proved to be deeply traumatic to the Iron Hands, and they struggled to explain their crippling defeat. The survivors drew sharply different conclusions. Many developed a grudge against all the participants of the heresy, the traitors for being weak enough to become corrupted, but also against the other loyalists for not being strong enough to protect the Emperor and their Primarch. Others became convinced that the Iron Hands and Ferrus Manus himself had been defeated because they had proven to be too weak and devoted themselves to self-hatred. Some drew far darker conclusions and went completely renegade. Large numbers of Iron Hands could not cope with the disaster at all. They went simply insane. Regardless, the majority of the Iron Hands consequently launched campaigns of redemption to both atone for their own perceived weaknesses as well as to take revenge on the traitors. As a result of the defeat at Istvan V, as well as their internal disagreements, the Iron Hands ultimately broke as a legion. One of the largest Iron Hand factions organized under Shadrach Medicine and waged a guerrilla war, nearly assassinating Horus, Fulgrim, and Mortarion during the Battle of Dwell. Medicine attempted to reforge the Iron Hands and their Raven Guard and Salamander allies into a new legion to battle Horus directly, but was undermined by the crazed cult of the Gorgon, which claimed that it had resurrected Ferrus Manus. Ultimately, Medusan, driven by vengeance, was slain at the Battle of the Arachna Chain. Meanwhile, another large Iron Hands force rallied under Autek Mor and devoted itself to the complete and merciless destruction of any traitors. Mor's most notable success was the complete destruction of Bot, a world used by the World Eaters to train its new troops. Other Iron Hands organized as part of smaller Shattered Legion groups, joining warbands that included Space Marines of several different legions. One such contingent was part of the Loyalist army that took part in the Siege of Baal. Another important Shattered Legion force was led by the Iron Hands Ulrach Branthan, and later Cadmus Tyro, who campaigned against the traitors aboard the Sisypheum. A large section of the Iron Hands retreated to Medusa, where they formed the Medusan Council and mass-recruited new Space Marines. These Iron Hands would only re-enter the Horus heresy during its later stages, launching counterattacks against the traitors, most notably the bitter war against the Word-bearers. The Medusan Council was largely recruited from individuals who had avoided the drop site massacre due to having been exiled by Ferrus Manus. Accordingly, this faction commanded little respect among other Iron Hands loyalists. The Medusa-based faction and other Iron Hands would later be accused of having turned to forbidden technology after Ferrus Manus's death, particularly the Keys of Hell. Finally, there were some Iron Hands who were so disillusioned after Istvan V that they took even more extreme steps. Some decided to strike out on their own, rejecting all masters and pursuing their own agendas, ignoring the wider Horus heresy. Others turned their back on the Legion entirely, becoming Black Shields and fighting without a Legion. There was even a force of Iron Hands who turned completely traitor, joining the armies of Horus and adding the livery of the Sons of Horus to their old Iron Hands heraldry. Following the Horus heresy, the Iron Hands were in a state of disarray and still reeling from their near destruction. The remnants of the Legion were split up into smaller chapters, with known descendants of the Iron Hands at this time being the Red Talons and the Brazen Claws. Those who were not split off were reorganized into the Iron Hands chapter. While many imperial factions bayed for blood and rushed to vent their fury upon their betrayers, the Iron Hands chapter gathered its strength on Medusa for a conclave known as the Tempering. There it was decided that no single individual would command the Iron Hands again. Instead, the Iron Council would oversee the chapter. The Tempering conclave further determined the human race itself, in all contemptible emotion, was to blame for the heresy and must be purged of flaws. So it was that the Iron Hands determined their guiding mission. They would exact payment for the wrongs done to them, but with a measured ruthlessness. In their every thought and deed, they would seek out weakness and destroy it, replacing it with machine-like fortitude. Thus began a bloody campaign that continues to this day, fought by the Iron Hands and those amongst their successors shaped by these teachings. Meanwhile, the Mechanicum devised a scheme to edit a pre-imperial document in order to better manipulate the Iron Hands to their will. This document became known as the Canticle of Travels. In the present day, the Iron Hands have a reputation for being relatively straightforward and incredibly harsh. In the Battle of Thranx, for example, the resources of several depleted clan companies were pooled for a full frontal assault using 5 land raiders against a facility bristling with anti-tank defenses that had made a mockery of previous attempts with whole armored companies. In the retaking of the Concours subsector, 1/3 of the population was summarily executed after a successful campaign simply to demonstrate the price of weakness. They are also known to be on poor terms with the Raven Guard, and after the liberation of the Keldar system from an Orc War in 810 of M41, refused to sit at the same feasting table as their Raven Guard allies. Additionally, the Legion is infamous for its extensive use of bionics, which has helped bring them into a close relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus. After the Horus heresy, when the legions were reorganized into chapters, the Iron Hands became recluses, attempting to find ways to make themselves even stronger so that they would be fit to serve under Ferrus Manus again at the end of times. Many within the chapter consider flesh to be a sign of weakness and seek to expunge it from themselves through mechanical enhancement. To this end, they have made it a practice to make extensive use of bionic modifications, going so far that there are rumors of some battle brothers being wholly mechanical. Iron Hands consider the greatest honor they can receive is to be interred in dreadnought armor. In the so-called Blessing of Iron ritual, the Iron Hands replace parts of their bodies with bionics. To accommodate such bionics, they also eschew the traditional office of chaplain in favor of their Iron Fathers, specially trained tech marines who serve to protect the faith of their brethren. Some outsiders view this, as well as the Iron Hands' ties to the Adeptus Mechanicus, as an unhealthy relationship. As for extra combat activities, between battles on their warships in the warp, Iron Hands often spend time uploaded to cryopods, inloading tactical schematics and information. This aids the overarching strategic hexamathic formulae that they deploy while on campaign, known as the calculus of battle. This system seeks to break down wars into raw data and numbers, where enemy actions, logistics, casualties, and environmental elements can be predicted and balanced like an equation. Once a conclusion has been reached, the Iron Hands' nihilistic brutality translates well to war. When they attack, they do so without hesitation or mercy, and will show little regard for the well-being of allies, as the calculus of battle has no factorial representation for civilians. Similarly, the calculum rationale gauges the necessary resources for any engagement and whether or not a commitment to it is worthwhile. This ruthlessness even extends to their own battle brothers, who will be coldly sacrificed to achieve an objective, should it be necessary to achieve a victory of worth greater than the cost expended. This does not deter warriors of the Iron Hands, however. Iron Hands fear no death and view injury in battle as something that should be sought after instead of shunned. Furthering their mathematical approach to war, their legion rarely commits to a campaign unless overwhelming victory is all but guaranteed. To that end, they employ Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests, known as the Magi Calculi, whose job it is to analyze data and ascribe to it strategic worth and the likelihood of victory. However, the Iron Council can overrule the decisions of the Magi Calculi, as seen when Cardan Stronos disregarded their conclusions and joined Guilliman's Indomitus crusade anyway. The Astartes of the Legion exhibit no known physical flaws that can be directly traced back to their gene seed, but it is possible that their extreme contempt for weakness in themselves and others may be due to an unidentified psychological flaw carried by their gene seed. Being Space Marines, the Iron Hands already have superior physiology, and the bionics that they embrace often do little to improve on it. Thus, some have suggested that the Iron Hands suffer from a sort of intense body dysmorphia, although whether this would be congenital from their gene seed or simply a result of their chapter culture is up for debate. As a final note, although the Legion boasts close ties with the Adeptus Mechanicus, they have been accused of tech heresy before. Notably, Mechwright Kalim Oros reported possible Iron Hands tech heresy that he had found in the Jericho Reach. Kalim Oros wrote he had witnessed terrifying biomechanical behemoths fusing man and machine into living weapons that fought alongside the Iron Hands against the stigmatous hordes in the Acheris salient and sported their heraldry on their hulls. He claimed to have examined the burnt-out wreckage of another of these weapon-studded behemoths, and he was convinced it was animated by the essence of an Iron Hands battle brother who had entirely shed every cell of his biological heritage, little more than pure hate and rage remaining to drive him ever onwards. Oros also claimed to have shared his findings with Inquisitor Callister. Archmagos Zinth received the report, but his reaction consisted only in ordering to send out monotask servitors and a secutor to the Celebos war zone and retrieve Kalim for adjustment, as he believed him corrupted. Whether or not these claims are substantiated is still a mystery amongst the adepts of Mars and broader Imperium. Thank you for listening to this entry from the Warhammer 40,000 Lexicanum.